Catechism of the Catholic Church. The mysteries of Jesus' public life following, in brief. The whole of Christ's life was a continual teaching. His silences, his miracles, his gestures, his prayer, his love for people, his special affection for the little and the poor, his acceptance of the total sacrifice on the cross for the redemption of the world, and his resurrection are the actualization of his word and the fulfillment of revelation, as stated John Paul II. Christ's disciples are to conform themselves to him until he is formed in them. Galatians 4:19. For this reason we, who have been made like to him, who have died with him and risen with him, are taken up into the mysteries of his life, until we reign together with him. No one, whether shepherd or wise man, can approach God here below, except by kneeling before the manger at Bethlehem and adoring him, hidden in the weakness of a newborn child. By his obedience to Mary and Joseph, as well as by his humble work during the long years in Nazareth, Jesus gives us the example of holiness in the daily life of family and work. From the beginning of his public life at his baptism, Jesus is the servant wholly consecrated to the redemptive work that he will accomplish by the baptism of his passion. The temptation in the desert shows Jesus, the humble Messiah, who triumphs over Satan by his total adherence to the plan of salvation willed by the Father. The kingdom of heaven was inaugurated on earth by Christ. This kingdom shone out before men in the Word, in the works, and in the presence of Christ. The Church is the seed and beginning of this kingdom. Her keys are entrusted to Peter. Christ's transfiguration aims at strengthening the apostles' faith in anticipation of his passion. The ascent into the high mountain prepares for the ascent to Calvary. Christ, head of the Church, manifests what his body contains and radiates in the sacraments the hope of glory. Colossians 1:27 and Sermon of St. Leo the Great. Jesus went up to Jerusalem voluntarily, knowing well that there he would die a violent death because of the opposition of sinners. Hebrews chapter 12, verse 3. Jesus' entry into Jerusalem manifests the coming of the kingdom that the Messiah King welcomed into his city by children and the humble of heart is going to accomplish by the Passover of his death and resurrection. Article 4. Jesus Christ suffered under Pontius Pilate, was crucified, died, and was buried. The Paschal mystery of Christ's cross and resurrection stands at the center of the good news that the apostles and the Church following them are to proclaim to the world. God's saving plan was accomplished once for all by the redemptive death of his Son, Jesus Christ. The Church remains faithful to the interpretation of all the Scriptures that Jesus gave both before and after his Passover. What is not necessary, that the Christ should suffer these things and enter into his glory? Luke chapter 24, verse 26 and 27 and 44 and 45. Jesus' suffering took their historical, concrete form from the fact that he was rejected by the elders and the chief priests and the scribes, who handed him to the Gentiles to be mocked and scourged and crucified. Mark chapter 8 verse 31 and Matthew chapter 20 verse 19. Faith can therefore try to examine the circumstances of Jesus' death, faithfully handed on by the Gospels, and illuminated by other historical sources, the better to understand the meaning of the redemption. Paragraph 1. Jesus and Israel. From the beginning of Jesus' public ministry, certain Pharisees and partisans of Herod, together with priests and scribes, agreed together to destroy him. Mark chapter 3 verse 6 and chapter 14 verse 1. Because of certain of his acts, expelling demons, forgiving sins, healing on the Sabbath day, his novel interpretation of the precepts of the law regarding purity, and his familiarity with tax collectors and public sinners, some ill-intentioned persons suspected Jesus of demonic possession. Mark chapter 3 verse 22, John chapter 8 verse 48 and chapter 10 verse 20. He is accused of blasphemy and false prophecy, religious crimes which the law punished with death by stoning. Many of Jesus' deeds and words constituted a sign of contradiction. Luke chapter 2 verse 34. But more so for the religious authorities in Jerusalem, whom the Gospel according to John often calls simply the Jews, than for the ordinary people of God. To be sure, Christ's relations with the Pharisees were not exclusively polemical. Some Pharisees warned him of the danger he was courting. Jesus praises some of them, like the scribe of Mark 12, verse 34, and dines several times at their homes. Jesus endorses some of the teachings imparted by this religious elite of God's people, the resurrection of the dead, certain forms of piety, almsgiving, fasting, and prayer, the custom of addressing God as Father, and the centrality of the commandment to love God and neighbor. In the eyes of many in Israel, Jesus seems to be acting against essential institutions of the chosen people. Submission to the whole of the law in its written commandments, and for the Pharisees, in the interpretation of oral tradition. The centrality of the Temple at Jerusalem as the holy place where God's presence dwells in a special way. Faith in the one God whose glory no man can share. Jesus and the law, number 1. At the beginning of the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus issued a solemn warning in which he presented God's law given on Sinai during the first covenant in the light of the grace of the new covenant. Quote from Matthew chapter 5 verse 17 to 19. Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have come not to abolish but to fulfill. For truly I tell you, until heaven and earth pass away, not one letter, not one stroke of a letter will pass from the law, until all is accomplished. Therefore, whoever breaks one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do the same will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever does them and teaches them will be called great in the kingdom of heaven.